The night smelled of rain and rusted iron. In the middle of nowhere, a lonely barn stood against the wind that dragged dust across the fields. A dying engine broke the silence. A man stepped out with a lantern in his hand, his face carved by years and labor. Just a few feet away, a fallen motorcycle, and beside it, a man in leather, bleeding into the mud. He didn't know who he was, only that he was still breathing, and leaving him there to die was not an option. Stay till the end, because this story proves brotherhood is louder than fear. Eli Turner lived on the edge of nowhere, a stretch of land where roads turned to dust and silence hung heavier than the sky itself. His farmhouse stood alone against the vast Nebraska plains, built from his father's calloused hands and the memories of a woman he no longer dared to dream about. The wooden porch creaked like an old heartbeat, and the distant lowing of cattle was often the only reminder that life still moved, even when he no longer did. Every morning came the same way, slow, pale, and indifferent. Eli would rise before the sun, boots sinking into the damp soil, breath turning to fog as he milked the cows and repaired the fences that time and weather never forgave. He spoke little, sometimes not at all. Since his wife's death, words had lost their shape. The whisper of the wind and the groan of timber had become his only conversations, quiet, predictable, and safe. But that night, the silence changed. It wasn't the calm hush of a sleeping field or the steady hum of crickets hiding in the grass. It was something broken, desperate, the gasp of a dying engine fighting to stay alive. Eli froze. For a moment, he thought it was his mind playing tricks again. But then the sound came back, closer this time, trembling across the dark hills like a heartbeat that refused to stop. He grabbed his lantern and stepped into the cold. The beam of light cut through the mist, finding the shape of a motorcycle, sprawled on its side, still warm, metal hissing in the night air. Beside it lay a man, leather torn, blood dark against the mud. Eli's pulse quickened. The stranger was breathing, barely, his chest rising in uneven waves. And in that instant, Eli knew one thing with quiet certainty. If he walked away, this man would die alone. He didn't think twice. He lifted the rider, dragging him through the dirt, boots carving a trail of red and earth. Inside the barn, he cleared a wooden table, pushed aside old tools and sacks of feed, and laid the man down under the flicker of a single hanging bulb. The wound was deep, a gunshot by the look of it, lodged between leather and flesh. Eli wasn't a doctor, but pain was something he understood. He'd lived with it long enough to know when it was trying to take someone. He worked through the night, silent and steady, washing the blood away with cold water, tearing old sheets into bandages, keeping the stranger tethered to life with nothing but willpower and instinct.
The hours dragged like years, until the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the barn wall, painting dust and blood in shades of gold. When it was finally over, Eli stood there, breathing hard, eyes fixed on the man's jacket. The leather was worn, burned by time, but the patch on his chest was unmistakable. A winged skull, faded yet defiant, staring back at him like an omen. He didn't need to ask questions. He didn't need a name. He knew, deep down, that this man was no ordinary traveler. That night, under the ghostly hum of a dying light, Eli Turner had unknowingly pulled a wounded soul from the edge of death and set his own fate on a road that would never let him turn back.
For 3 long days, the man hovered somewhere between life and death. He drifted in and out of shallow breaths, the color never returning to his face, the line between waking and dying as thin as the thread Eli used to stitch the torn flesh together. The barn smelled of rust, hay, and the faint metallic scent of blood. Outside, the wind kept whispering across the fields, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which of them would win, life or the road that had nearly claimed him. Eli barely left his side. He fed him warm soup spoon by spoon, spoke to him even when no words came back, and changed the bandages with hands that shook only when no one was watching. The man's jacket hung over a chair, drying by the small stove, black leather cracked by years of travel, the patch on its back staring into the room like a silent witness. To Eli, it felt like a ghost from another world had wandered into his quiet life, a world of noise, brotherhood, and danger that he had long forgotten existed. When the stranger finally opened his eyes, the light of the lantern caught them, sharp, cautious, and tired. He studied Eli for a long moment, like he couldn't quite believe what he saw. A farmer with rough hands, worn clothes, and the kind of solitude that can't be faked. His voice came out rough, almost broken. "Thanks, old man. Nobody would have done this for me." Eli's reply was as plain and unshaken as the land around them. "There's nobody else out here." They exchanged a silence that said more than gratitude ever could. In that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, not friendship, not trust, but recognition. 2 men who had both lost something the world would never return. His name was Cole. And though his wounds slowly began to close, his eyes never softened. They carried a kind of restlessness, the haunted gleam of someone who's seen too much and stayed alive anyway. Eli noticed it in the way he stared at the horizon, as if expecting something to come riding out of it. On the 3rd night, as the crickets sang and the lantern dimmed, Cole rose quietly from the cot. He stepped outside, barefoot on the cold ground, the wind tugging at the edges of his bandages. The sky was a black ocean of stars. He looked out over the empty fields and whispered to the dark, his voice barely more than a breath. "I'll tell them there are still good men left." By morning, he was gone. No note, No word, no trace, except the faint smell of gasoline and the marks of boot soles leading to the road. The table where he had lain was empty now, the blankets still warm. Eli stood at the door, staring out toward the horizon, listening. Somewhere in the distance, a single engine growled, fading slowly into the dawn, a sound swallowed by the wind, but one that Eli knew he would never forget.
Weeks passed, slow and heavy, the kind of weeks that seemed to drag eternity behind them. The days grew colder, the fields turned pale, and the quiet life of the farm folded back into its steady rhythm. Or so it seemed. Eli went on mending fences, splitting logs, and tending to the same chores that had always filled his hours. But something inside him had changed, though he couldn't name it. Every now and then he would find his eyes drifting toward the dirt road beyond the fields, listening for a sound he told himself wasn't coming back. Then, one morning, before the sun had fully risen, the silence broke. At first, it was faint, a low vibration rolling across the plains, almost mistaken for thunder trapped beneath the horizon. Then it grew, layer by layer, engine by engine, until the earth itself began to tremble. The sound was alive now, raw and powerful, a heartbeat made of steel and gasoline. Eli froze, the mug in his hand slipping slightly as he stepped to the porch. And then he saw them. A line of motorcycles stretched across the dirt road like a dark river made of chrome and fire. The early light of dawn caught on polished tanks and handlebars, reflecting across the landscape in glints of silver and smoke. The sound was overwhelming. Hundreds of Harleys breathing in unison, a mechanical storm that swallowed the morning stillness whole. At the front of the formation stood a man Eli thought he might never see again. Cole, alive, standing straight, steady, proud, his jacket repaired, the same winged skull stitched over his heart. He didn't raise his hand, didn't speak a word. He just watched Eli with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had returned not out of debt, but out of honor. No one said anything. They didn't have to. The engines spoke in their place, a low, rumbling language of loyalty and respect that no outsider could ever translate. One by one, the bikers began to move. Some climbed off their bikes, boots sinking into the soft earth as they approached the wooden fence that marked the edge of Eli's land. One man placed a sack of feed on the post. Another set down a can of fuel. Another left a small box filled with canned food and coffee. None of them looked for thanks. None of them lingered.
Then one rider, older, with silver in his beard and oil beneath his fingernails, stepped forward holding a heavy metal case. He placed it gently on the fence beside the others. The morning sun caught the engraving on its lid. For the man who didn't look away. Eli stood still, unable to find words, his throat dry as the wind carried the scent of oil and dust through the air. These men, strangers born of the road, had come not for vengeance, not for violence, but for something far rarer.
gratitude. For a long moment they all remained there, silent and motionless, until Cole finally gave a small nod. A single, subtle gesture, enough to send every man back to his machine. Engines roared once more, loud and proud, echoing off the distant hills as the convoy began to roll out, tires crushing the gravel like thunder fading into the distance. Eli watched them go until the last tail light vanished beyond the horizon and the world fell quiet again. Only the smell of gasoline lingered, mingling with the morning air. A reminder that sometimes the loudest thank you comes from the roar of 100 engines. If you still believe loyalty means something, subscribe to Hell's Road, because stories like this are far from over. The last echoes of the engines faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. The dust still hung in the air, catching the morning light like smoke from a battlefield long after the fight was over. Eli stood on the porch, his rough hands resting against the railing, eyes fixed on the horizon where the bikers had disappeared. He wasn't sure what to feel: gratitude, disbelief, or something deeper that didn't yet have a name. Then the sound of slow, heavy footsteps drew his attention. Cole was walking toward him, his shadow long against the dirt road, his leather jacket creaking softly with every step. When he reached the fence, he stopped, took off his gloves, and looked at Eli the way a soldier might look at the man who pulled him out of the fire. "The brothers wanted to thank you," Cole said quietly, his voice low and rough, carrying the weight of every mile he had ever ridden. "In our world, clean hands are rare, but yours reminded us who we are." Eli didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, his jaw tightening as he looked past Cole, at the army of riders still waiting on their bikes, engines idling softly like restless beasts. They were sunburned and scarred, faces carved by wind and years of road, yet there was something unbreakable in their stillness. They carried their history not in words, but in the way they stood, the way they breathed, the way the light hit the patches on their vests. Each of those scars told a story, each patch a promise, and every one of them had come here, to a forgotten farm in Nebraska, not for a fight, not for glory, but for gratitude. Eli saw it now, the quiet honor that lived between them, the silent code that held them together. Justice, loyalty, brotherhood, the kind of values the world had long stopped believing in, but that still burn on the open road. Cole glanced down at the patch over his chest, fingers brushing the winged skull stitched into the leather. "Out there," he said, tilting his head toward the horizon, "we wear our colors like armor. Every stitch, every scar, it means something. It reminds us where we've been and who we ride for." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Eli knew he'd never forget them. They wore their colors like armor, symbols of loyalty stitched in leather. You can carry that same spirit, The official Hell's Road gear is linked below for those who live by the code. Cole smiled faintly, pulling his gloves back on, and for the briefest second, Eli thought he saw something behind that hardened look. Not pity, not pride, but respect. A bond forged not by blood, but something even stronger. The road itself.
The moment felt eternal. A quiet peace settling over the farm like dust after a storm. The bikers were still gathered near the fence, their engines rumbling softly, the air thick with the scent of oil and sun-baked metal. Then, from beyond the fields, another sound broke through. Sharp, sterile, and out of place. The low growl of a government-issued engine. A sheriff's car appeared at the end of the dirt road, cutting through the haze and trailing a long cloud of dust behind it. Its siren lights were off, but the intention was clear. Trouble had found its way to Eli Turner's doorstep again. The car came to a stop just yards away from the line of motorcycles. For a moment, everything froze. No movement, no words. Only the faint crackle of heat rising from chrome. Then the door opened. A man stepped out, wearing mirrored sunglasses and a uniform that looked too clean for a place like this. His hand hovered near his belt, his posture stiff with authority and fear. He scanned the crowd of bikers, eyes narrowing until they landed on Cole. "You," he said, "we've been looking for you." Cole didn't move. He just stood there, his face calm, unreadable, the faint trace of a smile curling beneath the shadow of his jaw. The sheriff's tone hardened. "Word is, you saw something you shouldn't have. There are people who want to make sure you forget it." The words hung in the dry air, but no one answered. The riders stood silent, a wall of leather and resolve. The sun glinted off their steel, turning them into a single, unbroken line, a barricade of loyalty that no lawman could intimidate. The only sound was the low hum of engines, a deep, collective heartbeat that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Eli took a step forward. His boots crunched against the gravel, slow and deliberate. He didn't shout, didn't raise his hands. He simply looked the sheriff in the eye and said, in a voice steady as the plains themselves, "No one hunts good men on this farm." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. The sheriff's gaze shifted from Eli's weathered face to Cole's unwavering stare, and finally to the dozens of riders standing motionless behind him. Their vests gleamed in the sunlight, each patch a symbol of a promise: brotherhood, justice, loyalty. And in that silence, the sheriff understood. Whatever power he thought he carried with that badge, it meant nothing here. Without another word, he stepped back, climbed into his car, and turned the wheel. The engine coughed once, then faded down the road, swallowed by the same dust it had brought with it. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then, almost as one, the bikers fired up their engines. The sound rose, deep, thunderous, alive. Not a cry of defiance, but of victory. The air trembled with it. Birds scattered from the trees. The old barn shuddered under the weight of it all. Eli stood in the middle of it, his heart pounding in time with the roar, knowing he had just witnessed something he would carry to his grave, the day the road itself came to his defense. The engines howled once more before dying down, their echo rolling over the fields like a fading storm. Not anger, not rebellion, just honor, pure and loud as the morning sun.
When the last echoes of the engines faded into the distance, the world fell still again. The dust slowly began to settle over the road, painting everything in a soft golden haze, as if time itself had paused to catch its breath. The farm stood silent beneath the morning sun, every creak of the old wood and rustle of dry grass echoing louder now that the thunder was gone. Eli remained where he was, hands still trembling, heart pounding like an engine that refused to stall. The horizon shimmered with the memory of movement, a faint blur of light and heat where 100 motorcycles had once stood. And in that emptiness, he felt something stirring inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Peace. Only one man remained. Cole stood a few feet away, his jacket dusted with sunlight, the winged skull patch glowing faintly like an ember refusing to die. He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly over the gravel, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Words felt too small for what had just happened. Then Cole extended his hand, a simple gesture, but one that carried the weight of everything they had shared without saying. His voice was quiet, rough, but steady. "If you ever hear an engine at night, don't be afraid. It'll be us." Eli looked at him, his face lined by years of solitude and loss, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he smiled. Not because everything made sense, but because it finally didn't need to. He reached out, shook Cole's hand, and in that single touch there was understanding. A wordless promise between two men who had both lived too close to the edge and somehow found each other there. When Cole turned to leave, the sunlight caught the chrome of his bike, throwing one last glimmer across the farmhouse wall. The sound of the engine roared to life, not loud, not defiant, but alive, a heartbeat on wheels. As he rode away, Eli watched him until he vanished into the horizon, the faint echo of the motor fading into the wind like a memory carried by time itself. Eli stood alone again, but he wasn't the same man anymore. The silence no longer felt like loneliness. It felt earned. It felt right. And somewhere deep inside, gratitude rose up through the cracks of all those years of silence, followed by something even rarer, something he thought the road had taken from him forever.
Days passed, slow and golden, like dust floating through sunlight. The farm returned to its rhythm, the lowing of cattle in the morning, the steady creak of wood under Eli's boots, the wind whispering across the wheat fields as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened there. Yet beneath that familiar silence, something had changed. It wasn't the land, or the sky, or even the air. It was him. The quiet no longer pressed down like a weight. It felt lighter now, almost alive, filled with echoes only he could hear. Sometimes, in the stillness between dusk and dawn, Eli would pause in his work, lift his head, and listen, and from somewhere beyond the horizon, faint, distant but unmistakable, came the low, rolling sound of a Harley engine. It always started the same way, a soft hum carried by the wind, growing just enough to remind him that he wasn't as alone as he used to be. And every time it reached his ears, a small smile would find its way across his weathered face. Not because he expected visitors, he knew better than that, but because he understood now that the brotherhood never really left. It simply rode on, unseen, through the endless highways that connected men not by blood, but by the quiet promise of loyalty and respect. He would stand there sometimes, at the edge of his porch, watching the sun sink behind the fields, the light spilling across the land like fire over gold. The world felt bigger then, full of stories still untold, of people out there living by a code the rest of the world had long forgotten. And though the engines faded, and the silence always returned, it wasn't the same silence that had once haunted him. It was the kind that carries memory, the kind that stays with you long after the road has ended. Because deep down, Eli Turner knew one simple truth. For one night, the brotherhood had chosen him, and that was enough to change everything. That was one of the many forgotten legends of the road. But as long as men like Eli Turner exist, the spirit of the highway will never die. Subscribe to Hell's Road and ride with us into the next story.